Hey guys, tonight we open the curtain on one of the most brutal and strangely theatrical chapters in human history, the Roman Colosseum. That grand monument of stone wasn't built for fairness or compassion. It was built for awe, fear, and the kind of spectacle that made people forget their own miseries for a few bloody hours. So before we start, make sure you're comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a bit of ambient hum. If you're here, you probably already know this isn't going to be your average bedtime story. Now imagine yourself in Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. Not the romanticized version with poets and marble fountains, but the grittier, sweatier, more chaotic version where emperors tried to distract the masses with free food and jaw-dropping violence. The Colosseum wasn't built to celebrate athletic skill or fair contests. It was created as a theater of controlled madness. If you entered expecting balance and sportsmanship, you were in for a bitter surprise. People didn't come to see who fought best. They came to see who died best. The bloodier, the better. If a man flailed, screamed, or tripped over his own feet into a trap, the audience roared with laughter and delight. There were favorites, yes. Gladiators who had trained for years and commanded fame like modern athletes. But they weren't always the main event. Often, the day began with the human equivalent of kindling, captives, criminals, or debtors too poor to bribe their way out. These unfortunates were handed weapons that barely qualified as lethal and told to make it dramatic. And they did, because they had no other choice. To understand the Colosseum is to understand Roman stress relief. Life in ancient Rome was harsh. Plagues, fires, and food shortages were regular occurrences. But if you could watch someone else suffer instead, especially in a show where you got free bread and maybe a seat in the shade, suddenly life didn't seem quite so miserable. It was civic therapy, sponsored by the emperor, packaged as entertainment. Think of it as ancient Rome's answer to burnout. Here, enjoy a lion chase instead of a spa day. But don't think for a second that fairness ever entered the design plans. From architecture to action, inequality was baked in. The emperor got the prime seat under a canopy. Senators sat on cushions. Everyone else, stone benches and sunburn. The poor souls in the pit, armed with nets or wooden swords, fought not for glory, but for survival and perhaps mercy if they were lucky or particularly amusing. This wasn't just violence. This was a calculated political performance. When the Romans staged a fight, the idea wasn't to determine the better warrior. It was to reinforce hierarchy, to provide drama, and to give the audience a satisfying arc. The more imbalanced the battle, the more the crowd loved it. Gladiator versus amateur wasn't a surprise twist. It was a feature. Picture a trained warrior clashing with a baker who barely understood how to hold a blade, or a bureaucrat who'd spent more time arguing about taxes than preparing for mortal combat. And no, this wasn't a one-time mistake. These mismatches were planned. Sometimes the victims were condemned men. Other times, they were volunteers who believed, perhaps foolishly, that they could impress the crowd enough to survive. The professional gladiators weren't all slaves either. Many were free men who signed up for the fame, the meals, the training, and the chance to become legends. They lived in specialized schools, trained under instructors, and were more like brutal athletes than helpless prisoners. But when pitted against amateurs, their job was to kill quickly, and ideally, make it look good. Because the audience didn't want a real competition. They wanted a show with a clear hero and a doomed soul flailing toward fate. If you were the amateur, you had a few options. Option 1. Survive long enough to earn pity. Option 2. Get injured in a spectacularly funny or tragic way. Option 3. Impress the crowd with bravery or performance so much that they begged for your life. On rare occasions, someone did just that. A baker who stumbled comically but survived. A prisoner who fought so desperately the crowd fell silent. But most of the time, everyone knew how the story would end. Even the man sweeping the sand between fights could predict who wouldn't make it past noon. And if the crowd wanted something more exotic than a man being crushed by another, well, the Romans had a solution for that too. The beasts. So, let's say you're accused of a petty crime in Rome. Maybe you insulted the wrong noble, or perhaps you merely looked suspicious on the wrong day. In most societies, this might lead to a fine or some time behind bars. But in Rome, you might find yourself dragged into the Colosseum, standing in the center of the arena, facing a wooden gate. You hear the growl before you see anything, and then it opens, not with a whisper, but with the roaring arrival of your final judge. A lion. This wasn't just punishment, it was performance. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. A punishment for criminals, traitors, or simply the unlucky. This wasn't justice behind closed doors. This was state vengeance with front-row seats. And it wasn't subtle. The accused wasn't given a fair trial or a fighting chance. No armor, no real weapon. Perhaps a stick, maybe a rock. Something symbolic of futility. It wasn't a fight, it was a message. One loud enough for every citizen to hear. Disobey. And this is what awaits you. The animals. They weren't tired old circus cats. These were the finest imports the empire could find. Lions from North Africa, bears from the mountains, elephants from the east. Some were so valuable they traveled in better conditions than Rome's citizens. The prisoners, however, were tossed in like bait, clad in simple tunics, sweating under the sun, watched by thousands. There are tales, unlikely but recorded, of condemned men who ran, dodged, even climbed to temporary safety. One man supposedly played dead so well that the lion got bored. The audience, however, was not so easily fooled. They jeered until the guards made sure the show continued, because in the Colosseum, you didn't get to cheat death with cleverness unless it was entertaining enough. And yes, families brought their children to see this. Fathers pointed toward the arena, telling their sons, "This is what happens if you lie or steal." It was civic education through terror. Rome didn't separate punishment from amusement. It combined them into a singular, unforgettable lesson. But it wasn't just lions. As the blood dried and the sand was raked, more animals would be introduced. Not always predators. Sometimes it was Rome's version of a wilderness safari. Except the safari was trapped, hungry, and terrified. These staged hunts were called venationes, beast hunts designed to impress the crowd and prove that even nature itself bowed before the empire. They turned the arena into a forest, artificial trees, imported sand, carefully placed props. Then they unleashed chaos. Rhinos, ostriches, panthers, crocodiles. Creatures that had no idea what was happening, only that they were now in a strange place filled with noise and pain. Sometimes the beasts were sick or starved to weaken them. Other times they were just dumped into the sand and prodded until they attacked. And the people sent to face them? Sometimes trained specialists, other times just available bodies who hadn't yet been used in a better segment. Weapons varied, a spear if you were lucky, a sling or stick if you weren't. Occasionally, nothing. Just you, your sandals, and the hope that you were faster than whatever had claws. But make no mistake, this wasn't a contest of survival. It was a carefully curated pageant of mayhem. Whether the man triumphed or the animal triumphed, the crowd roared. On rare occasions, the animals even fought each other. There's a report of a bear and a lion ignoring the humans and turning on one another. The crowd was delighted. The organizer probably earned a promotion. Because in Rome, creativity and cruelty was a valued skill. The whole idea wasn't to test skill or bravery. It was to blur the line between punishment, art, and spectacle. Rome wasn't hunting animals. Rome was hunting awe. And for a time it worked. The screams, the growls, the blood. This was theater, the kind where no one ever forgot the ending. And just when you thought they couldn't make death more dramatic, the Romans added a twist. They brought in mythology. By now, you might assume Rome had exhausted its imagination for cruelty. But the Colosseum wasn't just a slaughterhouse. It was a stage. And when the crowd grew restless, when lions and leopards no longer dazzled, Rome dipped into its vast treasury of legends. Why merely execute someone, they reasoned, when you could turn their death into a story? Thus was born a dark genre of performance, fatal charades. These were not dramas acted out by trained thespians. They were executions disguised as myths. The condemned were forced to play parts, not by choice, but by decree. And these weren't symbolic roles. They were literal death sentences, wrapped in costume and legend. Imagine this. A man stripped of his name and rights, dressed in makeshift wings and told he's Icarus. He climbs a tall wooden structure. The crowd cheers. Then he's pushed. No wings, no flight. Just a brief fall, a snap, and silence. The myth has been performed. The lesson, whatever it was, is complete. Or take the tale of Prometheus. In the ancient stories, he's punished for stealing fire from the gods, chained to a rock, and left to suffer as an eagle eats his liver day after day. Rome reenacted this myth, minus the symbolism. They skipped the rock, but the eagle was real. The victim didn't survive long enough for the repetition. Then there's the tragedy of Orpheus, the musician who ventured into the underworld to reclaim his wife. The Roman version. A man with a harp, walking across the arena floor, serenading no one. Then, quietly, the gates opened and animals were released. Not ferocious, necessarily, just confused. The man dies not with song, but with screams. The message, if there was one, dissolved in the roar of the crowd. These weren't interpretations. They were executions with props. The audience didn't expect accuracy. They expected blood and myth stitched together. It was art, but the kind of art that made you look twice, and then look away. You could point to the stage and say, "Ah, yes, I know this story," while eating your midday bread roll. Rome had turned culture into carnage, and the performers, let's not forget, were not actors. They were prisoners, accused men, scapegoats. Their role in the drama was to die convincingly. There was no applause, only nods of satisfaction from the imperial box and the rising scent of sweat and fear. No curtain call, no encore, just a reset for the next tragedy. Yet for the crowd, this was refinement. It was theater and punishment in one. You could feel cultured for recognizing the story and entertained by the blood. If the execution was done well, if the costumes were elaborate, if the timing was sharp, it elevated the event. For a moment, it wasn't just death. It was narrative. But Rome didn't stop at land-bound myths. When even fatal charades began to feel repetitive, the engineers of empire had another idea. What if the Colosseum became a sea? The Romans had a remarkable gift for excess. It wasn't enough to throw men to lions or dress prisoners as tragic heroes. Eventually, even that carnage began to feel familiar. So, in a move that only Rome could have devised, they decided to flood the Colosseum. Literally, with water. Why? To stage naval battles. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't symbolic. This was engineering madness and political theater. Roman architects, brilliant, bored, and heavily funded, found a way to seal the arena's base, pump in vast quantities of water, and turn a stadium built for blood into a temporary lake. It was spectacle on a scale the world had never seen, a building not even near the sea suddenly hosting maritime warfare. These staged conflicts were known as naumachii, mock sea battles performed not with puppets or models, but with actual boats and actual people. The vessels, of course, were smaller than real warships. This was still a stone amphitheater, not a bay, but they were painted, decorated, and rigged with weapons. The crews, often prisoners or captives, sometimes condemned criminals, sometimes enslaved men who had no idea how to row, let alone fight. The script was simple. Row out, clash, pretend you're a seasoned admiral, and try not to drown. The audience watched from above, sipping wine and cheering as collisions sent men tumbling into the water. No one cared if they knew what they were doing. The more dramatic the fall, the louder the applause. If someone screamed something poetic as they were skewered or sank, so much the better. Sometimes these battles reenacted famous naval engagements. Other times they were pure improvisation, two sides thrown together, given vague instructions and oars, and left to create watery chaos. There were no real rules, no safety precautions, just painted boats, real blades, and lots of splashing. It was military history rewritten by theater kids with a vengeance, and the audience delighted. Watching ships collide inside a building was a novelty that never failed to amuse. It was absurd, and that was the point. This wasn't training or tribute. It was control, power. Rome showing it could turn a dry floor into a battleground and make drowning look like destiny. The emperor sat above it all, smiling, nodding, basking in the cheers. The message, again, was clear. Only Rome could do this. Only Rome had the wealth, the will, and the manpower to simulate war for fun. Of course, there were problems. Boats capsized. Fighters stabbed each other too early. Sometimes people forgot their lines, or oars snapped mid-charge. Ancient concrete, as it turns out, doesn't love being soaked repeatedly. Eventually, the practice was phased out. Water and stone, however dramatic, don't make the most enduring pair. But for a time, it worked. The Colosseum, already a monument to violence, transformed into a playhouse of sea blood and wooden hulls. Even if half the crew couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer, the crowd got what they came for. Chaos, spectacle, and the kind of story that would be told for generations. Yet even floating warfare wasn't always enough, because when the spectacle threatened to feel predictable, Rome had one more idea up its sleeve. Make the fights unfair, deliberately, blindfolds, shackles, wooden swords. Because why let skill speak when humiliation could shout louder? By now, you might think that Rome had reached the pinnacle of spectacle, turning myth into execution, sea battles into bloodbaths. But the truth is, the Roman appetite for spectacle was bottomless. And when standard matchups no longer thrilled, they didn't raise the bar, they tilted the arena. Deliberately. Because fairness was predictable, and predictability was boring. One of the Romans' favorite tools was the twist, the sudden change, the unexpected imbalance, the gimmick. What if, instead of two armored fighters meeting on even terms, one of them fought blindfolded, or shackled at the wrists, or armed with something so laughably ineffective it may as well have been a kitchen spoon? This wasn't chaos by accident. It was engineered humiliation. Take a trained fighter, one who'd survived countless battles, earned a name, perhaps even a fan following, and then strip him of his armor, shorten his weapon, or hand him something ridiculous, like a wooden sword or a net. Suddenly, the seasoned warrior became a flailing clown, and the crowd howled with glee. Blindfold matches were especially popular. There's something both terrifying and comedic about watching a man swing wildly at ghosts, spinning in circles, while the real danger stands just inches away, waiting to strike. It was a sadistic kind of slapstick, and Rome couldn't get enough. Then there were the shackles, iron cuffs around the ankles or wrists, or sometimes both. Fighters would lunge, only to stumble, jump, only to crash. In some cases, they were chained to each other. Yes, two men, bound together, forced to fight as one. One man stumbles, the other is dragged down. One flinches, both bleed. It was as if the Colosseum had invented the world's deadliest three-legged race. And yet, it wasn't just low-ranking fighters who suffered these indignities. Gladiators were valuable investments. Some were household names, with reputations, styles, and even primitive forms of merchandise. Their survival mattered. But even they weren't immune. If the emperor felt playful or the crowd grew restless, even the most seasoned champion could find himself fighting with one arm tied or facing two opponents instead of one. Or worse, facing something not human at all. There were trapdoors scattered across the arena floor, controlled from beneath by slaves and workers trained to operate them with terrifying precision. One moment, the sand was solid. The next, it opened, and out came a surprise. Another fighter, perhaps. Or a bear. Or a wild boar, teeth gleaming, hooves churning, enraged by the noise and the smell of blood. These were not fair fights. They weren't meant to be. They were entertainment born of cruelty, rooted in the belief that absurdity plus violence equals amusement. The audience cheered, not because the contests were balanced, but because they weren't. Because watching someone try to survive with a net against a sword or a stick against a leopard made them feel lucky, alive, and somehow superior. To be clear, this wasn't the entire system. There were matches, many of them, where evenly matched gladiators clashed in genuinely skillful duels. But those weren't the highlight reels. The showstoppers were the mismatches, the surprises, the gory punchlines. The crowd didn't come to be inspired. They came to be shocked, and the Romans, they kept delivering. Most arenas around the world offer a break between matches, a time to stretch, refresh, maybe grab a bite. In ancient Rome, this intermission was called the meridiani, and it wasn't filled with music or marching bands. It was filled with death. You'd think, after a morning of bloodshed and animal maulings, the crowd might be ready for something lighter. But instead, they got public executions, not the dramatic, myth-infused fatalities from earlier. No props, no lions, just raw, procedural killing, delivered with the cold efficiency of a state crossing items off a list. The condemned marched out at midday, their fates already decided. Criminals, deserters, prisoners of war, anyone who had broken the empire's laws or annoyed the wrong official. They weren't there to fight, they were there to die. Not with flair, not for sport, but to serve as warnings carved in flesh. And while their blood soaked the sand, the crowd ate. Merchants hawked olives and nuts. Children clambered for better seats. Some spectators grew impatient, not at the violence, but at the pace. "Hurry up," they muttered. "We want the real games." Because to them, this wasn't the main event. It was filler, background noise, the ancient Roman version of commercial breaks. Still, the state made sure these executions had structure. They were scheduled, timed, and often choreographed to maximize exposure. If someone had committed a particularly notorious crime, they might be given a more elaborate ending, perhaps dragged behind horses or made to stand on a platform so every seat could see. Sometimes the method of death was intentionally ironic, tailored to the offense. A thief might lose the hands he once used. A traitor might be stabbed in the back. It wasn't justice in the moral sense. It was messaging. The empire wanted everyone to know, this is what happens when you cross us, and they wanted you to know it while you were relaxed, mid-snack, casually wiping crumbs off your toga. There was no room for subtlety. The executions were loud, public, and devoid of mercy. No one pleaded, no one was spared. Even if the crimes were minor, the punishment was designed to be major, an overcorrection with an audience. And that audience? Desensitized, unmoved, unless something unexpected happened. Unless a prisoner resisted or begged with unusual flair. Only then might a murmur rise. Otherwise, the crowd waited impatiently for the sun to move and the afternoon fights to begin. That's what made it so surreal. These midday deaths weren't designed to thrill. They were designed to remind. that beneath all the cheers, all the drama, all the showmanship, Rome was still Rome. An empire built not just on conquest, but control. The Colosseum was more than an arena. It was a stage for power, and in that performance, every drop of blood served a purpose. In most systems of justice, decisions are made by judges, juries, or perhaps even laws written in dusty volumes. But in the Roman Colosseum, justice was loud, sweaty, and decided by people who had eaten too much bread and were halfway into their second jug of wine. After a gladiator match, the question wasn't just who had won, it was whether the loser would live. And the ones who decided that, tens of thousands of spectators. It was a strange kind of democracy. The loser, often bloodied, limping, barely able to lift his sword, would stand before the crowd and wait. If he had fought bravely, if his footwork was impressive, if he'd made the crowd feel something, there was a chance they'd spare him. If not, if he bored them, if he stumbled too soon, if his blood spilled without style, they might call for his end. Enter the thumb. You've probably heard the classic phrase, thumbs down means death. But the truth, like so much in history, is murkier. Ancient sources don't agree. Some say a thumb turned up like a drawn sword meant execution. Others claim a thumb down signaled mercy, as if sheathing the blade. Still others suggest the gestures were more like sweeping arm motions, vague and theatrical, less precise signals, more emotional cues. What's clear is this: the crowd's reaction mattered, and gladiators knew how to play to it. They weren't just fighters. They were performers, each with a distinct style. Some were showmen, taunting their opponents, roaring to the crowd. Others were stoic, silent, grim, earning respect through quiet resilience. They cultivated fan bases. People wore pendants carved in their likeness. They were painted on walls, talked about in taverns, admired, imitated, and sometimes mourned. And if the emperor was present, the stakes grew even stranger. He sat in his shaded box at the center of the action, flanked by guards and flattery. His thumb could override the crowd's verdict, grant mercy to a hated fighter, or demand death even when the audience begged for grace. And he didn't just decide, he performed. His gestures were slow, deliberate, watched as closely as the fight itself. A raised thumb became a statement, a withheld gesture, a moment of unbearable tension. Because the arena wasn't just about blood, it was about image. The emperor's decisions reflected his persona. Was he merciful, ruthless, playful, vengeful? Every call shaped public opinion. In this strange choreography of life and death, silence was the most terrifying judgment. If a gladiator died without fanfare, without cheer, without even a groan from the audience, it was as though he had never existed. Fame could buy you a second chance. Obscurity guaranteed nothing. Some gladiators survived years. They became legends. Others fell in minutes. The difference wasn't always skill. Sometimes it was narrative, a well-timed stumble, a dramatic last stand, a look to the emperor's box, blood in the eyes, asking for one more breath. The Colosseum wasn't just a battlefield. It was a stage where survival depended not just on strength, but on applause. Of all the creatures that clashed and clawed through the sands of the Colosseum, none quite captured Rome's strange sense of humor like the wild boar. You'd expect lions, you'd expect bears, perhaps even elephants or crocodiles. But a pig? At first glance, it sounds absurd, until you remember that the wild boar was no farm animal. These were not docile, mud-wallowing beasts. They were compact battering rams wrapped in muscle, with tusks sharp enough to split wood and enough rage to charge straight through a man's ribs. They weren't majestic like lions or exotic like panthers, but they were terrifying in their own unassuming way. Imagine standing in the arena, sword drawn, expecting a gladiator or perhaps a spotted leopard. Then, from the gate, comes a low grunt and a snorting fury on hooves. Short, fast, angry, a bowling ball made of meat and teeth. The crowd erupts, not in fear, but laughter. Because the unpredictability was the entertainment. Gladiators, trained in countless scenarios, were often caught off guard. You could counter a sword, you could anticipate a man, but a wild boar, that was chaos on 4 legs, and the chaos was the point. The boar didn't play by rules. It charged props, it broke formations. In one recorded incident, a particularly aggressive specimen tore through the stage scenery, bypassed its handler entirely, and nearly charged into the front rows. The audience loved it. Rome was addicted to contrast. The majestic lion inspired awe. The tiger drew gasps. But the boar? The boar made people laugh. Until it gutted someone. That blend of comedy and danger was a Roman specialty. Emperors got in on it too. Some hosted hunts in which boars featured prominently, either as the stars or as comedic foils. It wasn't just about exotic imports anymore. The empire had moved on to absurdity, to the unpredictable thrill of releasing something small but deadly into a grand arena. You didn't need a dragon when you had an angry pig. And the fighters, they did their best. Spears, nets, even small shields. Whatever was handed to them. Sometimes they won. Sometimes they limped off bleeding and humiliated. Tusk wounds in their thighs. Pride in pieces. For the audience, it didn't matter. They weren't keeping score. They weren't cheering for a victor. They were watching mayhem unfold, unrehearsed, unscripted, wildly Roman. Because in Rome, entertainment wasn't just about who fought best. It was about who got flipped into the air by a creature most people thought belonged on a dinner plate. And once the laughter faded and the blood dried, the stage hands went to work again. Resetting the props, cleaning the sand, preparing the floor for the next scene in Rome's elaborate, never-ending drama. But beneath that sand lay more than sweat and blood. Beneath it, a secret waited. Wooden lifts, iron pulleys, trap doors, and darkness. The Colosseum wasn't just spectacle. It was machinery. Beneath the sunlit violence of the Colosseum lay a hidden world. A network of tunnels, shafts, cages, and wooden lifts wound through the dark underbelly of the arena like veins under skin. From above, the sand seemed still. But below, the Colosseum lived and moved, a beast coiled in shadow, ready to strike. This subterranean complex, the Hippodrome, was the engine of Rome's spectacle. Animals snarled in cages, trapped in darkness until summoned. Props lay in wait. Trees, rocks, weapons, even entire mythological stage sets. Men worked silently in the gloom, listening for signals, hands on levers, waiting for the moment their piece of the play would rise. The lifts were ingenious. Wood and rope, counterweights and pulleys, ancient engineering that rivaled anything in modern theater. A team of workers, often slaves, could raise an entire platform with uncanny timing. A lion could appear from nowhere. A warrior might be lifted mid-fight, mid-roar. The floor was not a floor. It was a stage rigged for shock. Imagine being a gladiator, locked in combat under the burning Roman sun, sweat stinging your eyes, crowd roaring above. Then suddenly, the ground hisses. A panel slides, and out comes a leopard, its eyes wild, its presence unexpected. It wasn't part of the fight. It was a plot twist, and now you had to adapt or die. Sometimes the trapdoors released animals, sometimes props, sometimes entire backdrops designed to turn the arena into a mythical landscape, a forest, a desert, even the underworld. If the emperor wanted to see a volcano erupt mid-fight, it could be arranged. If a scene required Hercules dragging Cerberus from the pit, there were ropes, smoke, and men behind the scenes ready to make it happen. And yes, it failed. Sometimes the timing was off. A beast entered too soon, or didn't come at all. A platform jammed, leaving two fighters awkwardly circling each other while the crowd waited for something to emerge. But when it worked, when a lion emerged at the perfect beat, or when fire burst into view as a gladiator fell, it was breathtaking. It wasn't just combat anymore. It was theater with blood. The men beneath the stage weren't seen, but they were crucial. They controlled the pace, the rhythm, the illusion that the Colosseum had no limits. And they worked in brutal conditions, hot, cramped, full of noise and danger. A single mistake could ruin a scene, or kill someone. Yet the show always went on, because in Rome, a fight wasn't enough. It had to be a performance. The Colosseum didn't just pit man against man or man against beast. It pitted man against surprise, man against spectacle, man against a stage that could betray him at any second. The floor you fought on might vanish, the shadows might hiss, and what rose from the dark, be it lion, trap, or stage fire, could change everything. The gods may have judged the brave, but the Colosseum tested their balance. At first glance, two gladiators facing each other in the arena might seem like the fairest match Rome ever offered. These were trained warriors, both skilled, both armed, both hardened by years of brutal combat. It had all the makings of a proper duel, strength against strength, tactic against tactic. But this was Rome, and fairness was never the point. The truth was far more complicated. Yes, some matches were balanced, deliberately so. The tension of a close fight kept the audience at the edge of their stone benches. They cheered for each parry, gasped at every near miss. The suspense was real, but more often than not, the match was tilted from the start. A veteran with 100 battles behind him might be paired against a fresh recruit who'd only just learned which end of the sword to hold. The crowd knew. The organizers knew. Even the fighters knew. But it didn't matter. Because the outcome was only part of the show, the real performance was in how it played out. Weapons, too, were carefully chosen for maximum contrast. One gladiator might carry a short sword and a shield, while his opponent was handed a trident and a net. Not because it made military sense, but because it looked good. Because a heavily armored warrior clashing with a nearly naked, fleet-footed opponent created drama. It was brute force against speed, armor against agility. A human tank versus a barefoot eel with a fork. This pairing had a name, the Secutor and the Retiarius. The latter wore barely anything, carried no shield, and relied entirely on movement. His weapons looked more like fishing gear than instruments of war. But the Romans adored this match. It wasn't about technique, it was about symbolism. One looked unstoppable, the other looked fragile, and everyone wanted to see what would happen when their worlds collided. But sometimes the odds weren't just thematic, they were rigged. If a gladiator was popular, if he had fans in the stands or friends in high places, his fights might be curated for him. Easier opponents, better weapons, a narrative that let him shine. Because gladiators weren't just fighters, they were brands. If one drew a crowd, Rome leaned into it. It was good business. Merchandise followed. People carved little figurines of their favorite fighters. Children reenacted their duels in the streets. Their names were scrawled on walls, whispered in bathhouses, toasted in taverns. A gladiator with a reputation could shape the show itself. And if the favored fighter still lost, well, sometimes the emperor would intervene, or the crowd would roar so loud that mercy became mandatory. But if the underdog won, if the lightly armed net slinger somehow outmaneuvered his armored rival, then the Colosseum truly came alive. That was the story people would remember, the upset, the impossible. Still, such victories were rare. More often, the fight ended the way it was meant to, with one man bleeding on the sand, the other raising his sword and waiting for the verdict. Because even when two fighters seemed equal, they never really were. The scales were always tipped, the crowd was always watching, and somewhere in the background, The empire smiled. To most onlookers, the Colosseum was an arena, an immense circle of stone filled with cheering citizens and screaming fighters. But for the emperors of Rome, it was something far more valuable. It was a stage for empire-wide persuasion, a place where politics wrapped itself in armor and blood, and every match, every roar, every gesture from the emperor's seat reinforced a single message. Rome is strong. Rome is glorious. Rome is watching. From the very first games, the link between violence and control was deliberate. The arena served as a pressure valve for a restless population. The people of Rome might be overtaxed, underfed, and burdened with rumors of war or scandal. But put them in the stands, give them free bread and blood, and their anger melted into cheers. Distract, dazzle, repeat. This was empire management. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, wasn't just poetic, it was policy. As long as the games flowed and the food arrived, the people stayed loyal, or at least too entertained to rebel. And the executions. They weren't simply punishments, they were messages with costumes. Traitors didn't just vanish into prison. They died on stage, often dressed as villains from old legends. Someone condemned for plotting against the state might be costumed as a mythological betrayer, their death choreographed to make the point sing louder than any courtroom speech. It wasn't just justice, it was propaganda, played out before 50,000 witnesses. The emperor himself sat at the heart of it all, not hidden, not aloof, but visible, central, commanding. His seat, elevated, shaded, unmistakable, became the throne of judgment. When he raised his hand, thousands held their breath. His thumbs meant life or death, but more than that, they meant approval. His reactions were studied, cheered, feared. If he smiled at a gladiator's mercy, he was merciful. If he demanded death, he was decisive. Each gesture, each nod was a performance, a statement to his people, a warning to his enemies. Even the selection of events could be politically strategic. Want to celebrate a military conquest? Restage it in the arena with actors, prisoners, and plenty of blood. Want to impress a foreign dignitary? Nothing says hospitality like a tiger pouncing on an unarmed man. Theatrics weren't just for the public, they were diplomatic. And for the gladiators themselves, survival could turn political too. A victorious fighter became a symbol, proof of Roman strength, a living monument to discipline, order, and control. But if he showed defiance, refused to fight, begged for freedom, spoke too boldly, he could become a liability, a crack in the illusion. And the empire did not tolerate cracks. In the Colosseum, everything was curated. Even the chaos was planned. Rome may have been a chaotic, sprawling empire, but inside those stone walls, the message was sharp: power, order, and fear, all choreographed for applause. It wasn't just blood on the sand, it was policy. In a city of marble temples and smoky taverns, of senators and slaves, one place held every Roman in thrall: the Colosseum. It stood not just as a monument of stone and blood, but as a rhythm, a habit, a ritual that Rome returned to again and again, as though if the games continued, the empire could not possibly fall. But why did it last so long? The answer lies not in architecture, but in psychology. Rome was a vast and often fractious empire. At its edges, there were rebellions, within, corruption and famine. And yet, for a few hours, with a crust of bread in hand and the roar of the crowd in your ears, none of that mattered. The empire might be cracking, but in the arena, the story was simple. Here was control. Here was certainty. Here, Rome won. Spectacle became medicine. The ordinary citizen, overworked and overlooked, could arrive and see a charioteer fly past, a tiger leap, a man fight to the death. Suddenly, taxes felt distant. The bread might be stale, but the blood was fresh. Even the illusion of power, of participating in judgment, of voting with a cheer or a thumb, gave the audience a fleeting sense of control in a world run by gods and emperors. And the emperors? They were addicted too. The games were a shortcut to popularity. Raise taxes, host a week of fights, lose a war, set loose flaming chariots and call it art. The Colosseum was the empire's reset button. Any political misstep could be buried under a good pile of corpses and drama. Foreign diplomats, too, were dazzled. What better way to showcase Roman might than to stage a battle between men and monsters on command? A well-timed execution, a reenacted myth, a gladiator flying through fire. These weren't diversions, they were imperial declarations. And then came the mythology. Children grew up reenacting gladiator duels in dusty streets. Artists painted famous fighters on walls. Merchants sold trinkets bearing their names. The arena fed not just the body, but the imagination. It gave shape to Rome's ideals: strength, dominance, endurance, even when the empire itself was wobbling. Of course, nothing lasts forever. As Rome began to decay, from within and without, the shows lost their shine. The beasts became harder to acquire. The crowds grew less enthused. Even the architecture groaned under the weight of centuries. And yet, even in decline, the Colosseum remained. A monument to a civilization that believed, deeply and without irony, that entertainment could hold an empire together. Because for all its chaos and cruelty, the Colosseum told a story. Not of fairness or virtue, but of what Rome believed it was: powerful, eternal, center of the world. That story was shouted in every cheer, etched in every sword swing, buried in every body under the sand. It wasn't just a stadium, it was the beating heart of empire. Even the strongest stone eventually cracks. For centuries, the Colosseum roared, its sand soaked with sweat, its arches trembling with applause, its corridors echoing with the screams of men and beasts. But time has no audience, and Rome, mighty though it was, began to buckle beneath its own weight. The empire fractured, the borders bled, and somewhere between politics and plague, the Colosseum, once the crown jewel of Roman spectacle, began to grow quiet. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single final show, no dramatic curtain fall. Instead, the decline crept in like rot. The shows became smaller, less elaborate. Exotic animals grew harder to find. The best gladiators died or retired, and no new legends rose to take their place. The audience, too, began to shift. The thrill waned. The novelty wore thin. Eventually, the water stopped flooding the arena. The trap doors stopped opening. The engines beneath the sand fell silent. Rome had other worries: food shortages, invasions, economic collapse. The bread had run dry, and without bread, the circuses couldn't distract. But the structure remained. The Colosseum didn't vanish with the empire. It stayed vast and watchful, like a forgotten god. Weeds climbed its walls. Stone crumbled. Later generations scavenged from it, pulling bricks and marble to build new dreams out of old ruins. Yet still, it endured. Because something about it lingered. Even as centuries passed, and new religions took root, and kings replaced emperors, the memory of what happened there refused to fade. People remembered the games, the deaths, the roar of 50,000 souls united in a single moment of awe or horror. It was too big to forget, and even today, we haven't. We don't think of the Colosseum as a sports arena. We don't imagine it filled with peaceful festivals or harmless games. We remember it for what it was, a monument to spectacle, a reminder of how far a society will go to feel powerful, how easily entertainment becomes domination when dressed in pageantry, and how control, once wrapped in applause, can feel like approval. It wasn't fair, it wasn't kind, but it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage large enough to hold 50,000 people, fill it with iron, fire, politics, and blood, you're not aiming for peace, you're aiming for legacy. And Rome got exactly that. It's late April in ancient Ireland, and the air smells like damp soil and wood smoke. The hills roll soft and green beneath a sky that always seems on the verge of raining. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer squints at the horizon and mutters to himself, "Time to light the fires." This wasn't a casual decision. It was Beltane, the great fire festival that marked the turning point between seasons, the threshold from hardship into hope. The Celts didn't measure their year with paper calendars or ticking clocks. They measured it in light, in warmth, in how the earth breathed beneath their feet, and Beltane meant summer was near. The village stirred early. Livestock were rounded up, cows, sheep, goats, all restless from the long, cold months. People gathered wood. Not just any wood, but sacred kinds, chosen with care. The fires they were about to light weren't for cooking or warmth. They were for cleansing, for protection, for magic. At the heart of the ceremony stood the Druids, the spiritual stewards of the land. Cloaked and solemn, they carried chants older than memory. With gestures and incantations, they summoned the need fire, a central flame born from ritual, not routine. Every household fire in the region would be snuffed out and relit from this one source. It wasn't just symbolic. It was sacred. A spiritual reset button sparked with embers and breath. The flames rose, crackling like the voice of the gods, and the people responded. They led their cattle between twin fires, their hooves clattering against stone and earth. Smoke curled around their flanks, searing away disease, bad luck, and invisible threats. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was a force, a mediator between this world and the next. To walk through its smoke was to be reborn. And then came the humans. Some leapt over the flames. Young lovers, hopeful couples, brave souls with something to prove. It was said that jumping the fire could bless you with fertility, prosperity, maybe even love. There were stories of dancers who found their match on Beltane night, their paths crossing in sparks and shadows. Others danced simply to celebrate survival. Another winter gone, another cycle turning. The night grew thick with drums, laughter, and the distant bleating of sheep. Mead flowed. Stories were told. The sacred mingled with the joyful. Sometimes the dancing was clothed, sometimes not. That depended on the year, the mood, and the mead. When the fires finally burned low, the embers were gathered and scattered across fields. Ash for blessing, ash for bounty. The land, too, had to be fed. Because in the Celtic mind, nothing was isolated. Life, death, earth, fire, they all belonged to the same circle. And Beltane was the moment that circle turned. Not a festival, a ritual, not a celebration, a conversation with spirits, with the land, with the gods who watched through the flame. In the arid plains and mountains of ancient Persia, fire did not flicker in hearths as a servant. It stood in temples as a god. Here, fire had a name, Atar, and Atar wasn't merely a flame. He was the living embodiment of Asha, the divine order that held the universe together. While other cultures danced around bonfires for warmth or courage, the Persians bowed to fire as a sacred intermediary between heaven and earth. You didn't light it casually. You approached it as you would a wise judge, an eternal witness, a quiet God who saw everything and said nothing. This was Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. It shaped empires, influenced philosophies, and held fire as the bridge between the mortal and the divine. At the heart of this faith were fire temples, structures of stone and silence where flames were kept alive, sometimes for centuries, eternal fires. Never allowed to go out. To let one die was not just negligence, it was cosmic offense, a spiritual blunder on the scale of blasphemy. Within these temples, Priests called magi stood vigil, not with swords or scrolls, but with bundles of sandalwood, twigs, and eagle feathers used to fan the sacred fire without polluting it. They cleaned its space, protected it from wind, smoke, or stray breath. Fire had to remain pure. It was not just a symbol of the divine, it was the divine, flickering quietly in front of them. And it wasn't only in temples that fire held power. During festivals like Sada or Shahar-Shan-Besuri, the community gathered in the open. Massive bonfires were lit, and people jumped over them, not to show bravery, but to burn away illness, bad luck, and the spiritual grime of the year behind. As they leapt, they whispered prayers, "Give me your warmth, take away my sickness." Fire wasn't feared. It was trusted. It listened. But it demanded respect. Even in death, the Zoroastrians protected fire from impurity. They didn't cremate. To do so would sully the sacred flame with decay. Instead, they laid the dead atop towers of silence, where vultures completed the ritual. Fire had to remain unspoiled, untainted by rot, untouched by sorrow. To the Persians, fire was cosmic balance. It was justice that never blinked. It lit the world but asked for nothing. It exposed lies. It consumed evil. It warmed the faithful. You didn't just worship in its glow. You lived by its judgment. In this world, to tend the flame was to guard the line between chaos and harmony. And to lose that flame, to let it die, that was a darkness not even the sun could undo. In the city of Athens, under the cool shadow of marble temples and olive trees, fire didn't just burn in altars. It moved. To honor the gods, the Greeks didn't always kneel. Sometimes they ran. Through the dark, over stone roads, with flaming torches held high, they honored the divine not with stillness, but with speed. This was the Lampedodromia, the sacred torch race. It wasn't a spectacle for applause. It was a ritual, a relay where young men sprinted across the city, passing a lit torch like a baton, ensuring that the flame never went out. Because this fire wasn't just symbolic. It represented the very breath of the gods. To drop the torch, to let it sputter or die, was more than failure. It was a kind of sacrilege. You hadn't just lost a race, you had failed to protect the light of Olympus. The races were held at night, the only illumination coming from flickering torches cutting through the shadows. Runners were chosen for strength, speed, and devotion. But what mattered more than how fast they ran was whether they could keep the fire alive. The flame honored gods like Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, and Prometheus, the defiant titan who had stolen fire from the heavens to give it to mankind. A gift that sparked civilization and cost him dearly. For his rebellion, Zeus chained him to a rock, condemned to have his liver torn out by an eagle, again and again. So when Greeks lit their torches, they weren't just celebrating heat or light. They were reenacting defiance, gratitude, the debt they owed to a divine risk. The torch became a symbol of knowledge, resistance, and responsibility. Fire wasn't something granted lightly. It was something earned, protected, passed down, and it wasn't just metaphor. These torch relays were part of major festivals, like the Panathenaea, the grand celebration of Athena, or rituals in honor of Hephaestus himself. The routes were marked by temples and altars. Each runner played a part in preserving divine presence on earth. There were prizes, yes, wreaths, amphorae of olive oil. But the true reward was glory, not the loud kind, but the kind that lingers in whispered retellings. "He carried the flame," they'd say. "He kept it burning." When the race ended, the final torch was used to light the ceremonial fire, one that the whole city would gather around. And in that moment, it wasn't just a flame. It was a shared heartbeat. The glow of memory, the warmth of tradition, the promise that even in darkness, the gods had not turned away. So when you see a modern Olympic torch passed from hand to hand, know that it's more than a gesture. It is a ghost of that ancient ritual, a reminder that once, in a world of myths and marble, to carry fire was to carry the divine. In the ancient temples and open courtyards of India, fire wasn't just lit. It was invoked. It wasn't an element. It was a presence, a god, and his name was Agni. Agni didn't whisper from behind an altar. He blazed in the center of everything: weddings, funerals, births, oaths. Wherever life turned, he watched. His flames licked the edge of mortality and divine will, carrying prayers upward in curling trails of smoke. In the Vedic tradition, some of the oldest sacred texts in human history, Agni was more than a deity of flame. He was a messenger, a divine courier who traveled between realms. Mortals fed him offerings: ghee, grains, herbs, incense. In return, he carried those gifts into the sky, into the hands of the gods. He was fire, yes, but he was also communication. The rituals were exacting. Fires weren't just lit casually with a match or spark. They were born through friction, wood against wood, or sacred chants, coaxed into life by priests trained for years in the intricate rhythms of ceremony. Once ignited, the flame was kept pure. No pollution, no impurities. Even the direction the smoke drifted held meaning. The sacred fire pit was called the Havan Kund, often built in geometric patterns: circles, squares, triangles, each shape tuned to the cosmos. When the fire came to life, it didn't just light up the space, it transformed it. The space became sacred, a corridor between worlds. These rituals, called yajnas, governed everything from harvest blessings to spiritual purification. Priests recited mantras as they poured clarified butter into the flames. Each offering crackled, vanished, and was believed to reach gods like Indra, Varuna, or Savitri, riding smoke into the heavens. But Agni wasn't limited to rituals. He was present. In every home, families tended a domestic fire. Some never let theirs die. For generations, a single flame might pass from mother to daughter, burning in clay hearths, glowing during births and deaths alike. If it extinguished, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual emergency. In stories, Agni was unstoppable. He rode twin horses, had 7 tongues of flame, and devoured everything, but only when invited. He wasn't feared like wildfire. He was respected like an ancestor, like an ancient judge who offered warmth and wisdom, but also watched closely. Even today, traces remain. Weddings still circle fire. Prayers are whispered into flames. Smoke is still believed to carry intention, but in ancient India, it was more than tradition. It was theology. Agni saw the truth, and once you stood before his fire, offering your voice, your vow, your breath, you had spoken not to men, but to the gods themselves.